The 1950s were actually quite jam-packed if you think about it. This decade began rock and roll, the civil rights movement, better family living, technology updated majorly, fashion was changing, medical research advanced, and other wonderful things that Canada was not used to seeing or hearing. This decade were looked at more of a way of living rather than just another decade or time period in Canadian history. The 1950s was great for famous Canadian politicians to make their way and actually make change. The two I'm talking about today are Louis Saint Laurent and John Diefenbaker. Louis Saint Laurent was the Prime Minister of Canada from 1948 to 57 and was in office from November 15, 1948 to June 21, 1957. He was also part of the Liberal Party of Canada, was a lawyer, a politician, and lived from February 1st, 1882 to July 25, 1973. Under his leadership, Canada extended the old age pensions, put on hospital insurance, and improved provincial equalization payments. In addition, Newfoundland joined Confederation and Canada fought in the Korean War. Moving on to John Diefenbaker, he was Prime Minister from 1957 to 63, was a lawyer, a politician, part of the Progressive Conservative Party, and was born on September 18, 1895, and died on August 16, 1979. He was also a supporter of the civil rights movement for all by being an entertaining speaker. John Diefenbaker combined conservative politics and social justice issues. Diefenbaker worked hard to include Canadian on other ethnic backgrounds. He also gave Western Canada a high profile, but Quebecers didn't think of him well. Lastly, Diefenbaker succeeded in international human rights, but his defense policy and economic nationalism caused tension with the U.S. This decade was also struggling with three major wars, however, was helped out with peacekeeping. These three wars are the Korean War, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when North Korea's armed forces invaded South Korea. The war's combat phase lasted until July 27, 1953, and the United Nations forces consisted of 16 countries and 26,791 Canadian military personnel served in the Korean War during both the combat phase and the peacekeeping later on. The last Canadian soldier left Korea in 1957, and the two world wars, Korea remains Canada's third bloodiest overseas conflict, killing 516 Canadians and wounded more than 1,200. Moving on to the Cold War was a brief time of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. The reason this was called the Cold War was because there was never actually any casualty going on. The closest the U.S. got to fight the Soviet Union was in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The reason the Cold War started was because the Soviet Union and the U.S. wanted to see who was more powerful. The Soviet Union was trying to gain total power and take over all of Europe and encouraging communism. The U.S. was against this, and that is why part of the reason for the tension. This started during World War II on August 6, 1945, after Truman ordered the drop of the atomic bomb, and this ended on 1991. Finally, the Vietnam War was a conflict between the Communist North Vietnamese forces and the United States-backed Southern Vietnamese forces. Canada played the role of the neutral peacekeeper, but secretly helped the American effort in the Vietnam. The Communists invaded southern Vietnam, then this angered the Americans, so this led to Americans invaded Vietnam, and the main part of the war started. In conclusion, both sides were approximately equal in losses, so the U.S. decided to leave, which ended this war. Also, this decade contained the Treaty of NATO, which gave collective defense. The Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is an international organization made up of U.S., Canada, Britain, and other European countries. This treaty was established by Northern Atlantic Treaty in 1949 for the purpose of collective security. In 1949, it launched the Partnership for Peace Initiative, in order to copy alliance with former Warsaw Pact countries. Later on in the years, more countries became full NATO members, which added to the treaty. The 1950s also had a constitutional issue called the Royal Communism of Inquiry or on Constitutional Problems or Treaty Commissions. This was called for by the Premier of Quebec named Maurice Duplessis in 1953. The commission studies the problem of tax sharing between different levels of government and greater constitutional problems in Canada. It said that the maximum level of taxation would be established, the provisional responsibility of employment benefits, and shared personal and corporate tax scheme between the federal and provincial governments. This could be considered to be Quebec's view of Canada. And finally, many were happy to say that Canada's relationship with the United States has become very close since the Second World War, when the U.S. replaced Great Britain as Canada's main economic, military, and cultural influence. This was good news too, because this is the most important connection we have with another country. Although on other occasions Canada and the United States have very different policies on important issues, since the Second World War, this relationship has guided between the leaders of the two countries. At times, this has been strong and positive, while other occasions there have been serious issues. Economic events. The early 50s recession began in the middle of 1953 and lasted until the beginning of 1954. The total cost of recession was roughly $56 billion. This recession occurred because of the events during the earliest parts of the 1950s. In 1951, there was the Korean War, and later on in the year, there were more funds transferred into national security. In addition, inflation was expected in 1952, and the Federal Reserve set the monetary policy. Now moving on into depression. During the 1950s, it was good news for many to hear that there was no depression and many people didn't have to worry about being bankrupt or losing their job. During the 1950s, the unemployment rate in Canada changed during the decade, and it was different for men and women. But overall, the average for men was 4.71 and for women was 2.43 from 1950 to 1959. In addition, the GDP per capita in Canada was an outstanding $7,047 during this whole decade. Finally, in this decade, Canada also managed a trade agreement, which is called the Canadian Labour Congress, or CLC. This was created on April 23, 1953, by a combination of Trades and Labour Congress of Canada and the Canadian Congress of Labour, which were two major labour congresses in Canada at the time. The CLC was a national trade union Centre, which is a central labour body of Canada where most Canadian labour unions are in partnership. Lastly, this trade agreement belongs to the International Congress of Free Trade Unions. Social and cultural events. During the 1950s, women were mostly treated equally to men since they had many of the same rights like voting, getting a good education, and similar jobs. Also, in the 50s, women did the same work. However, if she was married, she would be looked at differently because that meant that her husband was not reliable. Some popular jobs for women included teachers, nurses, and many more. However, women weren't granted equal pay until the early 60s. Although this didn't matter to most women because many were stay-at-home mothers and spent their days keeping the house clean, cooking, and taking care of children. In addition, minorities and blacks were treated as second-class citizens in the 50s. This included not being allowed to eat in public restaurants, not allowed to use some public water fountains and restrooms, and they had to sit in the back of the bus. During the 50s, sports were as popular as could be. Baseball and boxing were most interesting, while football, hockey, and golf were making their way. Baseball was accomplished when tons of African American baseball filled major leagues. In the early 50s, abstract expressions were enormously influential. However, in the late 50s, color-filled paintings became more in focus to the next generation. Also, pop art was also continuously for advertising on television, photography, comics, and cinemas. In addition, literature was also very important in the 50s since it reflected the happy days in the 50s by symbolizing the conflict, behavior, and creativity of Canadian values by showing many well known authors and a large variety of novels and written work. The 1950s were also the decade where entertainment emerged as a result of more television shows being released and more top movies began to appear on the TV. This was the best time too because veterans of the World War II started families and wanted to relax by either entertaining themselves with their favorite TV stars or going to the cinema or dancing to their favorite music. Finally, fashion in Canada in the 50s was very organized because social order was very important and looking a certain way was a major part of that. However, fashion was a way that women expressed themselves at the time since women didn't have much rights. Girls wore tightly fitted sweaters, dresses, and putty skirts, while men wore suits, leather jackets, fedoras, and jeans. In conclusions, the 50s was a time in history when Canada began to grow through its advancements in music, technology, and its importance of an individual. Many of the events that occurred during this time inspired the future of an entire generation. This period of time also brought a huge change not only to Canada but the whole world.